Yeah, can you hear me now? Okay, I hate this. So, hi. Thanks. Thank you very much for joining us here tonight, especially when the weather is so great. I'm Elena Sudakova, director of Pushkin House, and I'm extremely proud of all the programs and all the events that we do here at Pushkin House, because all of them bring very diverse audiences and very different crowds. But I'm particularly pleased about hosting this one in quite a self-serving manner, actually, because strangely enough, London for me started with the avant-garde when I enrolled into the course of John Milner at the Courtauld. And then really continued for quite a while through my work for the next several years. Then I kind of switched to contemporary art and went into digital, and then I ended up here. So there's been a pause for several years, and I haven't been really following what's been kind of going out, and I haven't been present at academic conferences. And it's been such a pleasure for me to actually invite Sjeng Scheijen here and to get acquainted with this book. And it was just a delight to reconnect and revisit all these extraordinary people and this extraordinary movement. And Sjeng, as many of you know, he's an independent art curator, art historian, researcher. He was also an author of the highly acclaimed book Diaghilev, Alive, which went out in 2009. And also he was an attaché of the Netherlands in Moscow, and he is also a trustee of the Kharji Foundation, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, right.
Yes. And and so this is this wonderful book published by Thames and Hudson, which is available in our bookshop, and all of you can get acquainted with it afterwards and buy it, actually. But for me, and this is really the first question to put it sort of all in the context, and there was so much new information, and there is an extraordinary abundance of books written about Russian avant-garde, and yet I learned so much new. So how did that all come to light? How did it come about?
Firstly, thank you very much, Elena, for hosting me and having me here. It's absolutely great to have this full hall with this beautiful weather in London. I'm still quite proud of this book because it took me 10 years to write it. And that explains maybe already a bit about what you asked. So, yes, of course. So I worked a very long time in Russian archives, especially in Moscow, but also in other places. And I started with investigating the connection with avant-garde artists and politics. And it's a huge subject, of course. And my starting position was more or less what the main assumption is, and we talked about this already a bit, we'll be talking about it, that the artistic revolution and the political revolution were one, a coordinated historical event. But when I was going through all this, there were so many things that were more or less, mysterious, things that didn't fit into this narrative, that I just continued and really tried to get all of the historical facts, the whole chain of events of what happened with these artists within the whole, the storm of Russian Revolution, also a bit before the actual revolution, because of course, as it goes with revolutions, they do not have a specific historical beginning and a historical ending. That they just are a storm. They slowly start, and then it'll get to something. That I really put all of the effort into really trying to understand what happened and why people at a certain point in time make the decision they made, and not to come to a conclusion before I really understood it. So that was more or less my my way of working. And when working, I was also actually all of the time amazed of what I found next. And it presented problem after problem, because every time that I thought, now I have the narrative correctly, then there was something else that was completely incoherent with what I had in mind, and I had to start maybe all over again and put the pieces of the puzzle in a different order in order to understand it. So it was a hard process, but it came to something.
Right, well, thank you. So, and then just going back to this question about sort of artistic revolution being part of the political one. So many art critics actually claim that what happened then was very much linked to the politics and what was happening in the Soviet Union. So do you think that's justified?
Well, as a general statement, it's not justified. So there was a lot interaction, of course, as there always is. There was a lot of back and forth. At certain moments in time, there was a very strong connection between the political forces and the artists. But mainly, when you also, especially when you look at what their intentions were, it's absolutely the wrong assumption to consider it as a joint, a joint effort or art following politics. But obviously, you can only understand that really when you go deep into the facts. And let me just show one slide that I have prepared. We can go to many, but this is more or less why this whole idea of artists and politics as one movement came about. That at a very specific moment in time in 1918, many artists who are now world famous, avant-garde artists, became high-ranking officials in the Bolshevik government. And in itself, it's obviously a very unique historical feat that artists of this stature and this talent hold those particular political positions. And it's really part of the whole utopian thinking, one would say, of a socialist revolution, that artists and poets become part of the government. So even in the earliest socialist utopias, you see this as a recurring phenomenon. And now it really happens.
But Lunacharsky hesitated, first. So Lunacharsky, who was obviously the minister of the Enlightenment of that time and who was the godfather in a way. But he didn't quite to them. He didn't come to them immediately. He kind of.
And also, it's very good to understand that Lunacharsky, although he was an intellectual, he was himself, of course, a very creative man. He wrote plays and he wrote philosophies, and he was in the whole group of prominent Bolsheviks. He was the more liberal of all of them. But in the end, he was a politician. And when it comes to taste and his artistic beliefs, he was certainly not a defender of the avant-garde. He thought of Kandinsky as a pure madman. And he wrote that down as well. His artistic connections, his artistic instincts would have him connected with symbolism. And the first man that he considered actually to become a kind of minister of culture under the Bolsheviks, and who he thought was his main man when it came to the visual arts, was no less than Alexander Benois, who is obviously a completely different figure than these, who actually was their main opponent. And I think most of you will know who Alexander Benoit was, but he was one of Diaghilev's main designers and thinkers and friends. So that's why he is more or less well known in the West. And he was a ballet designer, an opera designer, but he was also an artist. He was an art critic, an historian. He was a kind of E.T.H. Hoffman of sorts, in a really incredible figure in the intellectual history of Russia, but certainly not an avant-gardist. And Benoit was Lunacharsky's man. But Benoit, in the end, didn't want to become politically involved. So he worked together with Lunacharsky very intensively, actually, but in the end, he didn't want to take any kind of political responsibility. He wanted to make sure that Russia's art treasures were well kept and were secured. So that was his main idea. He didn't want to have to do anything with the Bolsheviks themselves. He said, I'm a liberal and I cannot be part of this organization. So Lunacharsky had a problem. And his problem was that almost all of the existing figures within the cultural administration, both in government and on lower levels in museums and in theaters, were more or less opposed to Bolshevik rule. So they were continuously working against anything that Lunacharsky proposed. They were closing the theaters, and then they lost the key. They turned off the lights, you know, when Lunacharsky should have come in, and etc., etc. So he needed new people to follow up to his program. Of course, as a Bolshevik, he wanted to make a great overhaul of the whole art organization in Russia, and nobody really wanted to do this. Not Gorky, who also in the beginning was involved, and you know who you would think of as a natural ally of the Bolsheviks. Later, of course, he became, but at that moment still not. Blok was involved partly, but nobody of them really wanted to do that. Mayakovsky, who was more or less the broker between Lunacharsky and these artists, he was continuously knocking at Lunacharsky's door, and he said, I do have the people to do everything that is needed, but Lunacharsky didn't want anything to do with these crazy lunatics as he saw them. But at a certain moment, there was just, and it took me great pains to really try to find why did he change his mind so suddenly? Because it was a real sudden change of mind of Lunacharsky. So why did he took in the end all these radical figures, while he just a few months before had very publicly denounced them as crazies and lunatics who didn't understand anything about what, you know, a people's republic in the art world should look like. And that was that Lenin asked him to develop his plan of what he would call monumental propaganda. So Lenin's plan of monumental propaganda, which is more or less well-researched subject within the early history of the Soviet state, was a plan to completely overhaul and change the public space in all major cities, to get rid of all of the tsarist monuments and put new proletarian heroes in place and make public space into a space for propaganda. And this was also a utopian idea that Lenin took from the teachings of an Italian philosopher and humanitarian called Campanella. Yes, let's show that. So we can come back to that then later. I think I have many things, but we'll certainly not be able to show everything. Let's start maybe here. So he needed people to implement this, and in this particular time, 1918, when everything was still enormously in moving, of course. The Bolsheviks certainly did not have their power completely established. There was still a civil war going on. There was foreign troops coming in. Lunacharsky got this this task to do. There was no money and no people to do it. And then he thought, okay, now I need to ask the help of the lunatics. And then he had no choice. So I call it a marriage of convenience, but maybe a marriage of inconvenience is a better word. So they really had nothing else to do. And for the avant-gardists also, you would maybe think that they were supporters of Bolshevism, but most of them were anarchists. And so if there was a connection with a political movement, it was the anarchist movement. And also in 1918, this was not completely established yet. Many parties were still involved in the whole revolutionary movement. And although, of course, Bolshevism on the Bolshevik party was not their main adherents, these artists, they supported the revolution. They considered themselves revolutionary artists, leftist artists. They thought our time has come, but for them, revolution was more spiritual and an aesthetic, but especially spiritual, I should say, a spiritual event and not so much a political event. For them, you know, all these politicians, they would just follow him up on what they were leading, you know, a spiritual revolution, a revolution in the arts that in a way would pave the way for a completely new society. And the politicians, you know, they were just the minor hubris in everything was happening. So they agreed with Lunacharsky to do this for him and to take in these positions within the Bolshevik party, although some of them, especially Rodchenko at the time, was very much against working together with the Bolsheviks, but he also later added on, especially, of course, because they were extremely poor. There was nothing to eat. But because the whole history, especially the first years, is also a history of hunger, of deprivation of everything. They almost didn't survive it, and so they needed to go along with Lunacharsky's wishes because mainly, you know, they had no other choice. So that is how they got involved, and not because there was some kind of agreement, because they're one party. It was just one of those things that happens in history when chaos is complete. And then they started to do what they really wanted, because one of the main agenda points of the whole avant-garde movement already long before the revolution was the idea that the art should go to the streets, that arts should leave the museums, they should leave the artistic studios and took over street life, and that artists should do live performances on the streets, and that they, in any way possible, should take art to the street and to the people. So this was their moment, right? And Tatlin, who was in charge of the whole operation in Moscow, he was selecting artists to make these new sculptures, and he had a complete plan for this. And only one of these sculptures was ejected, really, so made, and this is a monument to Bakunin, made by a great sculptor called Boris Korolyov, and it's in concrete, which of course was deliberate. Firstly, there was no other material at hand, they had no marble or so, but concrete was a revolutionary material, obviously. It was a democratic material, it was a material that belonged to the new age, and that, you know, could be made into anything if possible. And it was enormous. And obviously Bakunin was an important figure for the Bolsheviks, although he was not a communist but also an anarchist. And then this futuristic piece was put in Moscow. But when Lunacharsky saw it, he immediately rejected it and was not able, or he just rejected the idea of opening it and really presenting to the public. So it stayed in the scaffolding for 6 months, and then it was taken down. And this is the only sculpture that really was made during this particular period of Lenin's plan of monumental propaganda. Later on, all kind of other monuments were erected, but they were not typically futurist or avant-gardist anymore. It's a historical thing, of course, but they had one other chance, and that is really something that I think is the Bolshevik government wanted to celebrate the first anniversary of the revolution, and they couldn't really control this process. They were far too busy. So the artists more or less had a free hand. They had no money, they had no materials almost to work with, but they did whatever they could. And what in the end happened, especially in then still Petrograd, was of a scale that is, I think, almost never repeated again. It's much smaller, for example, than the great sculptures in public space that Christo made, who are also, as you know, not small. But this is what Nathan Altman thought of doing with Palace Square. Now, Palace Square is obviously enormous. All the palaces should be painted in a kind of reddish color. Then, as you see, the entrances to the streets. So in the middle is the entrance to the Moika. Then left, for those who know St. Petersburg, and I think most of you will, to Millionaya Ulica, to the Million Street. And there was this enormous artistic installation around the big Alexander, what's the English word? Alexander column, exactly, yes. And that's an enormous thing, like as if the Alexander column became a rocket that exploded. And if you look here, then you can have an idea of the scale of this thing. So on the right you see it. You see some very small ant-like figures there as well. Those are humans. And if you see this picture, you see the suprematist or abstract installation around the column on top. And these are all the people that were standing before during the festivities that took place in then early November 1918 for the celebration of the first anniversary. So you can have an idea of the scale of everything, and also these big suprematist installations in between the streets were also installed. Like this this sketch. So it was an enormous piece of art made from this public space. And like that, there were all kinds of things happening. And of course, only a few of the artists that participated were real, what we should now call avant-garde artists. Most of them were either, Cuba futurist or any of the other modernist movements. But there are some actually became a big scandal because it was a nude woman, a Soviet Venus, Sovietskaya Venera. I think it's a later title, but at least. And you see here, this is in Moscow. Enormous futurist abstract decorations. And this is also Moscow. Moscow's also, there are a few less photographs or sketches left, but the whole square before the Bolshoi Theater was also made into an artwork, crystal-like in many ways, because all the trees were folded into a kind of blue garment, so that all these the trees had a kind of blue head on them, and all kinds of these kind of experiments that you would maybe connect with 70s or 80s nature art or public art were happening then already in Moscow and St. Petersburg. And it's an extraordinary moment, I think, in world history that this happened on this particular scale already in 1918.
Just to sort of finish with this topic, it then sort of continued in a much smaller scale in Vitebsk, right?
Yes.
And with agitprop trains and agit boats.
Yes, of course. So when this all happened, the reactions of the Bolsheviks were they were angry, they were just flabbergasted. This was nothing, of course, what they had in mind. And there was a campaign immediately started in the newspapers with reactions by civilians and by party officials who, publicly denounced everything that happened and said this should never happen again. And actually there was a not a law but an agreement within the party that the futurists should never hold any official position again. So this is what they established. And you can imagine it, obviously. If something like that would have happened anywhere in Amsterdam or in New York or in London, at that time, it would have caused a scandal also. So the fact that it was possible was a unique thing.
But they still continued to maintain positions, though, despite all this sort of public outcry. And it's sort of generally assumed that avant-gardists and museums do not go together. And that's based on the text that Malevich wrote, which kind of became his sort of manifesto on the museum when he wanted to eradicate all the museums. But the reality actually was quite different, and they ran quite radical museums and then later institutions, like art institutions, like in Hook. So can we talk a bit about that?
So when they were sent out of the government, and they didn't have these powerful positions anymore, but they kept their positions within some of the educational institutes, of course, Vchutemas, the main institution, but also in Leningrad and also other cities. And they still had some position in the museum organizations, because in 1918, Malevich became the kind of director of a very small part of the organization of the Commissariat of Enlightenment that should erect new museums of modern art. And in a way, he could position himself also in these new to be erected institutions. And Lunacharsky more or less gave that to them. Okay, you cannot rule the whole art world anymore, but I will give you the positions in the academies and these newly to be erected institutes of art, whatever form they would get. And as always, these people took this on them with enormous energy, and almost always against enormous problems that they ran into with the government and with subsidies and etc. etc. It was a continuous battle against the middle management of the Bolshevik party, but also of what was left of the older tsarist management, who of course also didn't like these people. But one of the things that they managed to do was two institutions, one in Moscow and one in Leningrad. The Institute of Artistic Culture in Leningrad, and you see it here on the left, which was in the Matveyev house, which was empty now, of course. The people who lived there, they fled to Europe, as so many of the palaces were empty in Petrograd and later in Leningrad. Also, of course, because the government was replaced to Moscow. So they could have this empty palace, and they just started to do, you know, whatever was possible. And sometimes they made exhibitions. So this should be a photograph of one of those exhibitions. I'm always a bit hesitant, but this is from a very serious publication, so let's assume that it's right and that this photograph indeed is from that particular institution. This should be from the Moscow branch, where is first Dravin, then Rodchenko, and then Kandinsky was the director of. And both institutions were part research institutions and part exhibition spaces, but also, especially in the Petrograd/Leningrad branch, was also a school. And they, you know, they more or less did everything that they liked to do. In Leningrad, Malevich and Tatlin worked together, and as you either know or hopefully will know if you read the book, it was an enormous strike. They had. They hated each other more than, you know, they hated the Bolsheviks or they hated the Tsars or whatever. They worked together in Leningrad, and Kandinsky, as said, was director of the Moscow institution. And the interesting thing is that they were not regular museums. I still don't know exactly if these institutions were open on a daily basis, because there is just not enough of a archival track record to really assume that they were open always, or that they were just open sometimes when there was a project there. And also because I know that they had such enormous financial problems that I'm quite sure that they couldn't be always open. So there's a letter that was a published letter, and I connected it to this particular institution that Rodchenko wrote there to either Lunacharsky or Sternberg, who was Lunacharsky's deputy, that he wanted to have one pair of shoes for one of the people who was working there, who worked as a courier. So he was, you know, walking back and forth, getting money and bringing art pieces, because this man had no shoes anymore, and without shoes he couldn't send him out into the street. So this was the, you know, the level of difficulty that they were working with. They had no typewriters, there was no ink, there was, you know, no heating, which is problematic, obviously, in Moscow winters. So this was, you know, if you have an idea of the managerial problems, it becomes a bit more clear how amateuristic, in a way, it also was. But they did wonderful things, and long before we went to see modern or contemporary art also as a part of research, the whole notion of artistic research, as we would call it today, is something that is maybe 20, 30 years old, and it was practiced here on a daily basis. And everything they did was never only to make art, but to research, to think about what visual culture meant in almost every aspect of that word. And a third institution, who is very often overlooked, was also founded by Kandinsky, who was the Академия художественных наук. To get them together and to understand what really was happening. It's not an academy of art, it's an academy of artistic sciences. So it's more like a branch of the Academy of Sciences, but then focused on the arts. But you see here, this was a French scheme that they made, and you would see that they had classes in sociology, in physico-psychology, in philosophy, and then this was mixed with literature, music, theater. They had a very important laboratory for bodily movements. So they had dancers there, choreographers. It was really a very, very ambitious endeavor, and mostly all of these people worked here for nothing, only that they got the ability and the space to work. So, and this institution more or less survived in a variety of forms, and yeah, became later the so-called Государственная академия художественных наук. That's a whole different chapter, actually, that is not really in my book, because it's not an art institute as we would call it today. So it's enormously rich subject to take on.
Yeah, and the same with Unovis, right? And Ginhuk as well.
Ginhuk is the Leningrad branch, but Unovis was a similar thing, mostly a school, but also a museum and also a research institute in Vitebsk. And that was ran firstly by Chagall and later on by Malevich. Again, two persons who did not really went very well together. So Chagall also, as a kind of odd one out, was part of this group, and he was the so-called commissar of the arts for then Belarus. So also a prominent figure in this whole movement.
So the book, once you get a chance to read it, I mean, it's fascinating. And the main plot is actually a relationship between Tatlin and Malevich, and you do devote a lot of sort of space and time.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I would like to make this very short addition that short of all this was happening, all these crazy historical events, I tried to make it into a human book. So it's very much also about a book about groups of people who really tried to do something extraordinary. And you asked specifically about Tatlin and Malevich, yes, of course. And I was, in a way, almost happy that the more I went into it, the more I saw that this antagonism between Malevich and Tatlin always came back, in a way, right? So they tried, because they hated each other so vehemently, they tried to not come into each other's circle, but at the same time, they more or less had the same ambitions, and in a strange way, they respected each other, of course, as well. And they very well knew that the other one was also a great artist, of course. So again and again, they came into each other's presence, and then it exploded again, and it presented a wonderful kind of dramatic line into the whole narrative, so that it not becomes a kind of dry, endless chain of events, but that it is connected with this wonderful battle between these two geniuses. And beyond that, sometimes it's funny, it's sometimes very sad, but it was also, for these people, I think, very necessary, because they needed each other to to define their own positions, right? So it was a necessity for them because it was so hard and difficult to maintain their positions, and it would have been so easy, of course, to make a compromise, as so many of the other artists did at the time, that I think this enormous antagonism also helped them in maintaining their own positions and defining their own positions and developing that further. So it had a function. It was not just something that was only destructive. It had a destructive side to it, you will see, but it had a meaning as well.
Unfortunately, we don't actually have much time left. So
I talked too much.
so it's just sort of me. But I really would like to talk, because all of that, eventually came to the end. And I had no idea about this sort of, alter ego, well, in a kind of very perversive way, of Malevich, of actually Yevgeny Katzmann, yes, who was his brother-in-law, and the role he played, well, directly or indirectly, in the fate of the avant-garde.
Yes. And that's also another dramatic. I think I have one picture. I hope. Maybe not. Maybe. Well, let's see. Maybe I'm wrong, but otherwise. Yes. Yes. Here. So this is not really Katzmann, but this is, and gives an idea. This is actually Isaak Brodsky, who was Lenin's favorite. So now you get to see, what Lenin's taste was. This is Brodsky's portrait of Lenin, made in 1919, so it was the first portrait ever made of Lenin, and later this is a very famous one, of course, copied many times, and this is the enormously huge painting that Brodsky made just after Lenin's death. And maybe there is another, no. No. The leader of ACHR, which is one of these associations of artists. It was the association of artists of the idea that proletarian art should be realist. It should be immediately understandable. It should be popular in the most, easy to understand way, and it should be made into a propaganda instrument for the government. And they were extremely successful in this. They were supported firstly by Trotsky and later on also by Lunacharsky, because he was under such pressure that he really needed them in a way to maintain his position, one could say. And in the end, more or less, they took over the whole art world in 1932. And well, everything what happened afterwards, they became the official artists, one could say. Katzmann was also very closely associated with Dzerzhinsky. And at a certain moment, even I had the idea that they had a kind of romantic relationship, because Katzmann's letters to Dzerzhinsky are so full of admiration, and he even in his diaries he talks about this. Oh, he is such a wonderful, beautiful man, and the clothes he wore today were so extraordinary. Well, nobody knows, but he was very, very close associated with Dzerzhinsky, which makes you think, and I'm almost sure of that he was an agent of the NKVD. So Malevich was very often living together in Nemchinovka, which was the family estate, or what was left of it. It was more like a dacha of his wife. And in summer, Malevich's children and the children of Katzmann were playing together, while Katzmann came regularly at the Kremlin. He was, painting the leaders there, making policies, and was fiercely, vehemently and aggressively attacking anything that was left of futurism, as he would call it, and later formalism. And he is one of the great architects of the anti-formalist campaign that later on destroyed the avant-garde, but also destroyed, for example, Shostakovich, or at least attacked Shostakovich, and many of the other progressive or modernist artists at the time. So this was something almost incredible, right? So that Malevich had to put up with this man who was, even his friends thought of him. They said about Katzmann, he's a man who doesn't like children and he doesn't like animals. And so that more or less portrays him, I think. And if you read his public speeches that he gave continuously, it has so much aggression. It's not even hatred, it's something more. And in the end, of course, I think that Malevich died just early enough. He died in 1935 after he was incarcerated 3 times, tortured, I think. I cannot completely prove it, but gathering everything, I think it's also have, you know, the death of his brother-in-law on his conscience. So that's a really dramatic ending, this is in a way how many of the great ideals and ambitions that came with the revolution, maybe not as a intrinsic part of it, but they were part of the whole revolutionary idea, of course, which, as I said before, was for many people more a spiritual and a psychological movement than a political movement. But they ended, as so many of them, in mid-30s.
Shall we open the floor to the audience? Do you have any questions? Yes.
Thank you very much. I read your book on Diaghilev, which I thought was wonderful, so I'm looking forward to reading this. Can you just say why were Malevich and Tatlin sort of fighting each other? What was the intellectual argument? And was this dissidence in the futurist movement between them, but also presumably between others, did that sort of hasten its demise, or would it have happened anyway because of the change in ideology in Russia?
Yep, thank you. So the first question is about the intellectual and artistic disagreement, which started already somewhere in 1912, 1911, when they both came up and presented themselves both as leaders of the whole movement. And from the beginning on, they used each other in a way to define themselves more radically. So, as I said before, it was both destructive but also productive for them. And more and more, Malevich became an artist who identified with the cosmic, with everything else but materiality and the earth, etc., etc. And Tatlin, he identified himself as the artist of matter. So in 1913, Tatlin started making these reliefs out of scrap material. In Paris, that's a wonderful story, and I will not go into that. And then he started to make these reliefs, and he presented a kind of philosophy with that, in that an artist should make sure that the viewer became connected with materiality again. So it was all about what he would call materials. And at the same time, maybe as a reaction to that, Malevich developed suprematism, which is an art movement that is not so much about abstraction, but about thinking. Or they became two fractions. So there were Tatlinists and there were suprematists, the suprematist followers of Malevich. And because resources were so scarce, nobody had money, nobody had materials, they were fighting, you know, for their position. It was also very and they wanted to have space. You know, if you know the famous picture out of the 010 exhibition, most of you will know, I think, oh, I'm sorry, now this goes wrong. Well, I think you will know, right? The famous picture of Malevich's installation of the Black Square and the first suprematist works that he presented in 1915. The reason why Malevich put them in this particular position was that there was just no space there. It was really a very cramped exhibition space. Here it is, yes. Two back. Yeah. Yeah, here. And just around the corner of this particular space, there was Tatlin's space, and he also had just two walls. And he made these kind of first relief works that were installed within the wall. So they came for the first time, were not part of the wall anymore, but really came loose of it. And so also Tatlin, I think he was first actually put an art piece in the corner. So, and this all had to do with this, you know, they were experimenting and they didn't have any space. When there was the possibility to exhibit something, you know, they needed to cramp everything up, and everybody, of course, was trying to get attention. So that makes it a bit more understandable, maybe, and especially Tatlin, who was less able than Malevich to theorize and to take care of himself, I think. He suffered from this. So he became paranoid, more or less, you could. Many anecdotes about this, how Tatlin tried to maintain the secrecy of his studio so that Malevich could not come in. And he had some students. He knew how, you know, what the sound of Malevich's feet was on the stairs, and he gave access to his students so that they could defend the studio if Malevich would try to come in, you know. So it had also a carnivalistic aspect, which goes through the whole of this movement. They tried to dramatize things. They love to do that. They try to make narratives out of their lives. It's also part of their idea to bring art and life together, which, as I tried to explain in the beginning, is one of the main, maybe the most important feature of the avant-garde. It's not abstraction, it's not revolution, it's not you know, the new thing per se. It's real, the complete and full connection of art and life into one.
Thank you for that wonderful taster of your book. With Elena, I studied under John Milner 12 years ago now, and this has raised all sorts of memories for me, one of which is as follows. I think I remember that the reason that the Black Square was put in the corner of the room, because that was traditionally the icon position, okay? And second, I think I remember that Tatlin began his career as an icon painter. Yes. So, even if only one of those things is true, my question is really this. We think about all the disjunctions and ruptures with the past. What elements of continuity, if any, existed between this generation and previous generations of Russian artists? Thank you.
because there are many. Of course, disruption was extremely important for these people. But there are enormous and important connections, especially with the generation just before, the generation that they vehemently denied, of course, and the symbolists. But for the symbolists, also the connection between art and life was of extreme importance. And we see that, for example, in if we can mention that, Diaghilev's productions, where also the variety of artistic disciplines came together, and also the continuous living of the artistic atmosphere was important. And in Diaghilev's journal, Misconceptions, you see the connection between poetry, between literature, philosophy, arts, art history, and if you see how these people lived, they also lived, you know, lives of continuous creativity, and for them also art didn't end at the walls of the museum or the walls or the doors of the artist studio. So there are many, especially more philosophical connections between the symbolists and the whole Misconceptions group, and also, I should say, international symbolism with the avant-garde. And you don't see that, it's not mentioned so often because aesthetically they were so very different. But philosophically there were a lot of things going on. And even if you look more aesthetically, especially in the whole evolution of Malevich's art, who I even more than before when I started this book became to admire. My very personal instinct go to Tatlin, but Malevich is really, because also maybe just more is left of his legacy, is an artist of although he is obviously extremely famous. But if you look at his first periods, so this whole period where he made these very small, very often gouaches and aquarelles with, you know, rising saints and mystical figures. This is one-on-one symbolism, and there is a very direct connection between these early Malevich works from 1907 and 1906 and earlier on, and what he did with suprematism. Although aesthetically they are worlds apart. So yes, and I would have loved to go deeper into that, but because, well, the starting point, of course, enough possibility to go deeper into that, but that's really a very interesting story, also for an exhibition, I should say, to go deeper into. Yes, please.
Thank you so much. Very fascinating. I have two questions. The first is, at which point Wassily Kandinsky decides to leave Moscow with all his high position and go to Bauhaus, and if there is a continuity or as cuts in relation to Shostakovich, if you just.
He was in this particular period in Russia. Very often you see, if you go to Kandinsky exhibitions, you see German artists, you know, born in Moscow. It's really nothing of the sorts. So Russia always was a point of reference for Kandinsky, also when he was living in Munich before the war. But when the war started, there was no question on his mind that he should return to Russia, while many of the other artists who were, the Russian artists who were residing in Munich, were staying there, or they went to Switzerland. But Kandinsky returned because he couldn't live with the idea that maybe for many years onwards, he would not be connected. So he lived in Russia again from 1914 to 1922, if I'm correct. Yeah, I think so, or early 23 when he left. Okay, it's in the book. And quite immediately, when the revolution started, he became part of the revolutionary movement, also because Lunacharsky could far more easily connect with Kandinsky, who was a European intellectual, who was much older also as a lawyer, as a and it was also somebody who could, for example, write a policy paper. And that was the kind of people that Lunacharsky needed vehemently, and all the others, they couldn't. So Kandinsky got all these positions, and it was extremely interesting for him because he led this whole research movement. And as you know, already long before the war, even he was very interested into the philosophy of arts, in the way that the various artistic disciplines interconnect, music and colors, etc., etc. So it was understandable why he stayed so long already. It became, of course, very problematic for him. I think the main question should be, why did he stay so long, right? But it's really this. It was the intellectual challenges that he had that it made so interesting for him. Although he saw what was happening around him, I think he saw it better than the others. But he had the possibility, because he had already a public in Europe. He could speak French and German very well. So he didn't spoke any other language besides Russian and Polish and Ukrainian. Tatlin also didn't spoke any Western European languages. So they were more or less confined to Russia, while Kandinsky and Chagall also, who of course also had a time working in Paris already and had a public there, and they could return quite easily. And it's really interesting why he stayed so long. And this is one of the things in Kandinsky's biography who got more or less a bit suppressed, especially because of Nina Kandinsky's memoirs, who really tried to put this more or less under the table, because afterwards, especially when he was living in the United States, it was not so fashionable anymore, of course, to have been a part of the Bolshevik endeavor. So that's one of the questions. And the other question is about Katzmann. Well, the reason why one doesn't know is mainly because it also is one of those parts of cultural history that is very rarely written about. And later on, I must say, but this is one of the typical aspects of Stalinist society, he himself came into trouble because he was a former Trotskyist. But at least till 1937, Katzmann was an extremely powerful figure. And firstly, of course, he lost Dzerzhinsky, who died, and I don't know exactly when, but and then later on, yeah, he became when the anti-Trotskyite campaign, what's the English terminology? Trotskyist campaign really started, he also became into trouble. So that's why he was also in Soviet historiography more or less put aside. So that's one of the reasons. Yes, please.
I'm really looking forward to reading the book. I've got a cold, but I would prefer to shout, really. Is that all right? Can you hear me? Oh, I didn't know there was an yeah, well, you just mentioned Trotskyists, and I'm actually a supporter of all the ideas of Trotsky against Stalin, and I think historic reasons. But before I came to this discussion, I really wanted to know about Tatlin, and I've learnt a lot about Tatlin, but there's one thing I still haven't learnt, is why his tower was never actually built, because he had this design for the tower that would go sort of into infinity in tribute to the Third International that was being established. And it was never built. I thought there was some replica came and got built in London at one stage, but maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm wrong. But I was wondering about that. And
I would like to show some pictures of Tatlin's tower, because it's an extraordinary thing. This is the actual model that Tatlin built, and here we see him building it with his students. So, yes.
But where? I mean, maybe you can answer.
Yes, of course.
Because
this is also one of those stories that is, in a way, typical of what happened. Tatlin had this idea of this. Firstly, it was a kind of tower, you know, like the Tower of Babel, actually. So, as the Tower of Babel dispersed all the peoples around the world and made them, fight each other because they couldn't understand each other. In his tower, all people would be reconnected again. This was the main idea that he started with, and then he connected it with the Third International. So it became a monument for the Third International. And of course, the International was also an idea of connecting all the people of the world. At that moment already, the relationship between Tatlin especially and Lunacharsky had become sour. So Tatlin promoted his ideas, but nothing came of it. And then the Ministry of Enlightenment, or the Commissariat of Enlightenment, made for Tatlin's tower, and it was signed not by Lunacharsky but by Sternberg, who was an artist quite close to the avant-garde, and Lunacharsky's deputy when it came to the visual arts. And in that contract, there is nothing about an assignment from the government to Tatlin to build this tower. It was really, it became clear that it was Tatlin's own initiative, and that they not so much gave him money to do this, but that gave him the opportunity. Or so they decided that he shouldn't be worked against. And if he would show this contract to people who had a factory, so they should give him material to make this model. So no money, no obligation of the government for anything actually, but only this kind of promise. Imagination. He was promoting this and showing this contract everywhere as a sign that he was given the assignment to make this monument to the Third International. And he, so the notion that this actual thing was really what was ever intended by the Commissariat of Enlightenment. But he managed to do so, and I found in European newspapers of the time, even provincial ones in Holland and in Germany, big essays on this, this great monument that is going to be built in Moscow. And it's all a fantasy that Tatlin endlessly repeated, and that, became into reality as a plan. But it was never intended that way. And when Tatlin, in the end, finished the model, he placed it in the one of the palaces in Moscow where many of the meetings of the Third International took place. So all these international figures had to go besides this monument. And it was also, again, a kind of initiative of himself. If you go into the many official papers and putevодители that were printed at the time for all the foreign visitors, there is no mentioning, never, anything of Tatlin's monument. But in the press releases afterwards of all these, international figures who came back home and were writing in the newspapers about it, they are writing about, Tatlin's tower. And there was a moment when Tatlin got the possibility to show the monument to Lenin. And of course it was a kind of pivotal moment, one could say. And actually Tatlin made not only this model, but there was a mechanism inside as well, because it was intended that the internal volumes were to become enormous ministries, right? It should have become 400 meters high, so 100 meters higher than the Eiffel Tower, at that moment the highest construction in the world. And then it should send over the message of the international through radio waves and to other planets and whatever. There's a few wonderful articles written about the tower by Anatoly Strigalyov, who is really the main historian of this subject. But then it was presented to Lenin, and one of Tatlin's assistants was laying under the thing. So if you see it over here, you see that there is this quite high pedestal. Tatlin is leaning on it, and under this pedestal, one of Tatlin's assistants was laying, and he was, making this whole thing move inside. And then, of course, at the moment when Lenin came in, it stuck, and Lenin never, he just shook his head and went away. And later on, just I think 1 year later, it stayed there because there was, of course, no place to store it. It was so huge. Even the model is 7 meters high. Tatlin was working in St. Petersburg, and then he got notice from friends that people were slowly deconstructing his work and firing up a samovar with it. And this is a very realistic story, because everybody was looking for wood at the time, because there was always this enormous lack of wood for fires, etc. So, and he because etc. They're firing it up into the samovar, but when I don't know exactly what happened afterwards, but at least it's clear that it disappeared. But Tatlin made two more versions of it. One for the 1925 World Exhibition in Paris, a smaller variant, and that ended up in the end in the storages of the Russian Museum in Petersburg, and then was also given to the flames during the blockade. So during the and the third one is also disappeared. So this is what happened with them. They continue to be reconstructed, and I know you have made a wonderful reconstruction when you were. Yes, great.
Thank you so much for this discussion. It was very interesting. I would like you to ask about any female artists that were part of the movement, and could you tell us a bit more about them?
Yes, of course. It's a pity that we didn't came to that. But if you look at the, let's say, 10 most important avant-garde artists at the time, 5 of them were female. So that's an extraordinary feat, of course, and of course part of the revolutionary atmosphere. But it's also not a completely new or disruptive thing, at least not in Russian art. Because also if you look at earlier art movements, also, for example, the Mirskuzva group, that there are a lot of quite prominent female artists, and it's a extraordinary feature of. Oh yeah, here you see the reconstruction of Tatlin's towers in here in London. It's an oh yes.
And actually, this piece, this Le Tatlin, it's huge. I mean, it's well, it's not that huge, but it's sort of 9 meters is the width of the wings, and it's in the Science Museum. I don't know whether they're actually going to show it anytime soon, but they have it. So maybe you'll have a chance to see a reconstruction of Le Tatlin here in London.
And yeah, Le Tatlin is one of the flying machines that. So to come back to the female artists, so it is extraordinary, and also something that's still, although many exhibitions have given attention, of course, to the female artists. There's a famous Amazons of the Avant-Garde exhibition, which was held in the Guggenheim Museum and in other get more attention, because especially at this time when the involvement of women in the arts gets rightly so much more attention, Malevich or Kandinsky, but with the broader avant-garde movement, because women played such an enormously important role in it, and a very what kind of natural and ongoing role. They were not secondary figures, right? They were continuously also active in the debates and in the theoretical development of the many ideas that were developed by the avant-gardists. So it's an important theme and aspect of this movement. Yes. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Sjeng. This has been brilliant, and we've merely just really scratched the surface.